Hey buddy, watch this.
Hello, Regis Gilbin is the name and Hearthstone is the game, and these are 5 cards that have been brought back to life by the Witchwood. And what I mean by that is these are essentially cards that really never saw play, or at the very least haven't seen play in a very long time, but because of new cards in the Witchwood, because of shifts in the meta, suddenly these cards have been given a new lease on life. They're back in the game, they're being played, and I think that's awesome. So it's something I love to spotlight. I love when long forgotten cards people have deemed as terrible, are suddenly brought back into the limelight and making an impact, proving that cards, even if they don't fit right now, sometimes just have merits. They have aspects and characteristics about them that are just strong. They're fundamentally good, and if you give them the right environment, if you give them time, eventually they might just shine. I think that's awesome when these old forgotten cards get to come back. It's one of my favorite things in Hearthstone every time we have an expansion, to see what makes a big return or shows up for the very first time. That said, let's go ahead and talk about these 5 cards that have been brought back to life by the Witchwood. Up first here I have Ironbeak Owl, and normally I wouldn't want to include a tech card in a list like this. Maybe I have in the past, but tech cards are kind of boring to include in lists like this because tech cards in general are things that tend to pop up and pop out of metas just depending upon what is there. So for instance, Mind Control Tech might have been another fitting card for this list, which again, another tech card good against wide boards. Ironbeak Owl, of course, great against silenceable minions. But Ironbeak Owl has a unique attribute in this meta specifically that I wanted to call out, because pretty obviously we'd all determined for a very long time now, ever since the Ironbeak Owl nerf long ago when it went from 2 to 3 mana, that Spellbreaker was a way better silence to tech into your deck than Ironbeak Owl. Because for only 1 mana, you get a much larger minion that's more apt to trade on the board, that's sometimes fine to just play by itself as a 4-attack minion. Ironbeak Owl is a 2-1, just seemed terrible in comparison to Spellbreaker. So for a long time, nobody played Ironbeak Owl. Spellbreaker was the silence of choice if you needed a tech silence in your deck. But now, thanks to Baku, the Moon Eater, and the way she has completely shifted the meta into a handful of very dominant odd decks, suddenly you can't run Spellbreaker in hyper-aggressive odd decks, which most decks successfully have been most successful odd decks thus far have been of the more aggressive variety. There's things like Odd Rogue, Odd Paladin, and Odd Hunter, all of which can use Ironbeak Owl to help them push through with additional damage when they're just looking to kill their opponents. There's also, of course, Odd Warrior, which is a little bit slower and defensive, but even it can also use Ironbeak Owl as its tech silence of choice. So suddenly, Ironbeak Owl is like the go-to silence. It actually still doesn't feature a more popular play rate than Spellbreaker. Spellbreaker is honestly still number 1, but they're right there together near the top of all cards when it comes to their popularity. So Ironbeak Owl has very much skyrocketed in terms of play rate ever since the Witchwood arrived. No real surprise, being propped up by Baku in some ways, but I'm almost glad to see this little chubby owl back in play. He's annoyed me a lot in the past, and he still annoys me sometimes today, but the Hoot Hoot is here, and you know what? I don't hate it. He's a cute card, so why not? So up next here we have a really interesting card. This is Amani Berserker. And this one comes as a bit of a shock to me. Now, it's not the most surprising of all the cards on the list. There are a couple more that completely blow my mind. But Amani Berserker is one of those 2-drops that's just been around forever. And I can't remember it ever seeing any substantial amount of play in constructed format. It's always been one of those cards that seemed really solid in Arena, because sometimes you could just trade into a minion in the early game, and you'd have this 5-attack guy lingering around that might be able to trade up into something again. So it was a great Arena minion just because of that board presence and threat that it offered sometimes. But I don't remember it ever being substantial in a constructed deck, just because most of the time it's a 2-3 that doesn't really do anything else, and that's just not good enough. But suddenly, in the Witchwood, with a bit of a restricted card pool, because we just had the standard format rotation, there are decks that are able to successfully use Amani Berserker. Most namely are Paladins with Call to Arms. Cheating out an Amani Berserker as a part of your Call to Arms is a lot better when there are a few different threats on the board and your opponent sort of has to decide and dictate which threat they're going to address, which means the Amani Berserker can sort of linger around. Not to mention, in a meta with a lot of 1/1s around with Paladins, Amani Berserker is good at cleaning those up and becoming a pretty threatening 5-attack minion, all of which is cool. But even Mage Tempo Mage is finding ways to play Amani Berserker. And I think that's because Tempo Mage is ultimately a very aggressive deck that is looking to do damage to the opponent's face. They have to get chip damage in the early game so that their burn spells late will be able to finish off their opponent. And it turns out Amani Berserker is a very unpredictable, in a sense, because I never expected this would happen, but surprisingly efficient way to do that. Because, again, in a meta where there's a lot of small stuff out there, Amani Berserker can take a trade, and sometimes he just becomes a 5-attack guy that hangs around on the board and gets to hit face for 5. And for a 2-mana commitment to do 5 damage to the face for Mage, that is absolutely the stuff of dreams. So, weirdly enough, Amani Berserker actually fits. Completely insane, but here we are, Amani Berserker, a playable 2-drop and arguably even a great 2-drop in constructed Hearthstone. So now up to the third card. This is absolutely a card I never thought I'd put in one of these lists. It is Stormwind Champion, and it's being played in constructed format Hearthstone. Stormwind Champion showed up actually alongside Raid Leader, another card I never thought would see play. One I didn't include on this list because they kind of go hand in hand here. You could almost put either of them on this slide or both of them on this slide, and it would be fitting because they're both inclusions that have really only made the cut in odd Baku Paladin specifically. Because, once again, when you place all those restrictions on mana costs of cards in your decks with Baku and Gin Greymane, you have to look outside the box a little bit. You have to dig a little bit deeper to find cards that fit. And it turns out Stormwind Champion is wonderful in a deck that can very easily reload the board with tons of small minions going wide, thanks to the upgraded Baku hero power for Paladin, constantly summoning 1/1s, alongside, of course, a handful of other ways to just load up the board with tons and tons of things. So suddenly, Stormwind Champion becomes this fantastic follow-up that just provides a ton of pressure and makes the board a lot harder to resolve. Of course, playing a 6/6 on top of it as well can be problematic for some decks to deal with. So you can almost think of it as like this pseudo Sunkeeper Tarum, right? It's obviously a lot worse than Sunkeeper Tarum because the buff isn't as big and you don't negate your opponent's threats in the meantime, but it almost serves that same sort of function, this follow-up. Also, Silver Sword, I guess, works kind of the same way today. Or Level Up. All of these cards contribute to the same goals, but Stormwind Champion is just one extra piece in the puzzle that you need to fill in all the gaps because you have to run 30 cards in a deck, and there just aren't that many good odd cards. So Raid Leader and Stormwind Champion actually showed up. Now, I will admit that already Odd Paladin has started to fall off a little bit, and if you look at the played rate for Stormwind Champion, it is dwindling some, but it remains a deck that you can see in competitive constructed Hearthstone. Right now, it's still in, I don't remember the exact number, but a surprisingly high percentage of decks. It's like, wow, that many people are still playing Stormwind Champion. That is nuts. And I'm thrilled about this because I have actually been touting Stormwind Champion as a reasonable card alongside Frostwolf Warlord for a really long time in budget decks. Those are two of my go-to budget cards. And I always say, like, look, guys, these are actually pretty good follow-ups if you're able to go in a wide board deck. I've always thought that. They've never, ever made the cut because there are probably admittedly better options available most of the time. But here we are, and even in the highest levels of play, this card was part of the best deck in the early Witchwood meta, and is still part of a high tier 2 deck in the Witchwood meta. So Stormwind Champion, it's one of those cards you overlook, you kind of laugh at. It seems like an arena-only card, but it has those attributes and characteristics that make it good. It has things that are great about it, despite being a basic card. Sometimes free-to-play stuff and budget stuff really does work after all, and Stormwind Champion here, I think, is a perfect example of that in action. And now we have another card here that's basically been brought back to life because of the Baku and Gin playstyle, and once again actually brought back to life, of course, in Paladin, because this is a Paladin card, Avenging Wrath, at 6 mana. Now, this thing, I guess, is very, very occasionally seen some constructed play in the past that I can remember, but incredibly rarely. It's just not that strong of a card if you think about it. 8 damage for 6 mana, spread across random stuff, can be problematic to get working. But in an even Paladin deck, with Gin Greymane specifically, once again, you have to find cards to run. And it turns out that right now, Avenging Wrath is actually a really good card to run for a few different reasons. I've talked about this before. There's a lot of 1/1s in the meta. Avenging Wrath can be very, very good at just chipping through a board of 1/1s, and of course doing a little bit of chip face damage as well. Beyond that, it combos very nicely with equality. So sometimes you can just have those equality Avenging Wrath turns to kill a few giant health things, but also do like 5 damage to the face alongside your board of giant things, you know, securing lethal, clearing taunts, and clearing the board for this perfect finisher piece. And then other times it's just 8 damage to the face when you need some extra reach in your deck and you're just looking to end the game very quickly. So it turns out when you have less cards, Avenging Wrath actually works pretty nicely with a few different things that Paladin is trying to do. So in even Paladin decks, which, mind you, are the very best decks in Hearthstone right now, even Paladin as at the top of Tier 1 currently in Hearthstone, and suddenly, you know, a card you never thought you'd really see is in the best deck in Hearthstone, and it's something you see all the time now, and it's actually influential and impactful and good. Avenging Wrath has absolutely not only been brought back to life, but it's been brought into dominance, to the forefront of the game. That is crazy to see, but frankly, I think a pretty welcome sight. I like seeing old cards once again. It's almost like they're new cards because you've forgotten them. You never ever see them being played. So it's almost like you get extra new cards when the expansion is released. Avenging Wrath, what's that card? I've never seen that before. That's awesome. So even though even Paladin can probably be frustrating to play against, and Avenging Wrath has probably cost you a lot of games, I think if you really sit down and you consider it, you might just be happy to know that a card got another chance to find success. And then finally here for my last card, I have one that's obviously not a part of the basic or classic set. This is Hadronox from Knights of the Frozen Throne, but nonetheless a card which never saw any real true competitive play in Hearthstone until right now. Hadronox was one of those things that a lot of people saw potential in because, you know, it does a really big, scary, crazy thing, right? It's one of those cards that we always wanted to work. And of course, I, like many other people, tried numerous times to get Hadronox to work in the past few metas in which she was released. But unfortunately, it was just too hard to fit it all together. She was too slow, too hard to kill. But now one major thing has changed, and basically one new card made Hadronox playable, and of course created an entirely new deck that is basically a tier 2, maybe tier 3 deck, depending on the day, which is Taunt Druid. That card being Witching Hour. New Druid card, 3-mana spell that summons a random friendly beast that has died this game. And if you build your deck in a very specific way, where Hadronox is your only beast, that means that you can now summon a Hadronox for 3 mana. So that does a couple things. First off, of course, it means you can now play 3 Hadronoxes in your deck, essentially, because you have your real Hadronox, then you have 2 Witching Hour Hadronoxes, and that's awesome. And then, of course, you can add in 2 Carnivorous Cubes to kill those Witching Hour Hadronoxes, or, of course, your first one, and suddenly you can run 4 more Hadronox for a total of 7 Hadronoxes, Hadroneses. I don't know what the pluralization of Hadronox is, but that makes the deck complete. That gives it such a late game value bomb. You just keep going off with Hadronox after Hadronox, summoning an endless wave of taunts that it can outvalue almost any deck in Hearthstone. And of course it has lots of defensive potential as well because of all the taunts that it naturally wants to run, making it therefore a viable deck that it never was in the past. So yes, like N'Zoth Hadronox back in the day seemed awesome, but compared to Hadronox Witching Hour Carnivorous Cube, that was nothing. And this is finally a spin on the card that works. And I love that. That's awesome. This card looks so cool and so fun, but it was just never quite there. And all it took was one new card, arguably 2 with Carnivorous Cube, to suddenly give Hadronox another chance. And then we cracked it. Then we figured it out, and it's an awesome deck that's really, really fun to play because it's so darn greedy and so darn defensive. So Hadronox now, a relevant card. And this is exactly why, too, I should say, I always tell you guys, I cannot really recommend that you dust a card. I'll say, yeah, it seems like you're never going to play Hadronox. And I probably was quoted saying that 5 times, 10 times, 100 times. Like, Hadronox might be a safe craft or a safe disenchant, but you never really know. maybe a new card will come out that makes Hadronox part of an awesome deck. And that's exactly what happens, and it's exactly why you have to be careful when you get rid of cards. Now, obviously, if you're trading that dust and turning it into something really good right now, that can obviously still be worth it. That can be a great decision and a very efficient maneuver for you from a dusting standpoint. But I don't think you should just willy-nilly disenchant everything because it's not being played right now. Hadronox is absolutely proof that cards which seemed unplayably bad before can suddenly become very, very powerful with just a few small changes in the meta or with, of course, new card releases. So there you have it, guys. 5 cards that have been brought back to life. And really, I think they all teach us a little bit of a lesson about how to think about Hearthstone, how to look at old cards, how to judge them, and maybe how to keep hope for cards that we had long given up on because they might just have their time in the spotlight yet. That said, if you guys have other cards you thought were brought back to life by Witchwood, and I know there were a handful here I didn't talk about, please share those in the comments. Share your take. Share what you learned based on those revitalized cards. I'd love to hear your opinion. But until then, of course, thank you so much for watching. And until next time, game on.